Well, first off, I want to thank the editorial board for allowing me to come in once again. This has been a regular visit, and we want to continue to keep it that way, even during the off-election years, because I think it's good to be able to get in with this board, especially with your community members, and talk about what's going on in Washington. You know, I got elected to office just a hair under 4 years ago, and running now for my third term. And when I sat in a room like this in 2012, I talked about going to Washington to actually move along some bills that had been stalled. They had been stalled for a while. One of those is a highway bill, a long-term infrastructure bill. We were able to pass the first long-term infrastructure bill this Congress in the last 10 years. And that is crucial to projects like our high-speed rail project here in Springfield. It's crucial to projects that we know are in the future, like extending MacArthur Boulevard from where it ends today southward. Those are the type of long-term visions that I went to Washington to actually accomplish. It's not something that's in the 24-hour news cycle, but it's something that's very important to communities like Springfield and in our surrounding areas, especially as we look to see the completion of Route 29, hopefully in the next few days. We also reformed our education, K-12 education bill, No Child Left Behind, has been reformed. There's not a single piece of legislation that I think had, by the time we reformed it, had both sides chomping at the bit to make sure we made some changes. And we were able to do that. And one of the amendments that I put in there, it actually brought back local control. The amendment that I put forth would ensure that the federal government didn't supersede local bargaining contracts, local collective bargaining agreements. You can't get much more locally controlled than that. And the entire reform bill was based upon bringing more control back to our school districts, so our parents, our teachers, our administrators and school board members have more of a say than somebody sitting in a concrete building in Washington, D.C. I was able to pass my Hire More Heroes Act, which reformed the Affordable Care Act so that small businesses can actually be incentivized to hire more of our veterans. We also passed many VA reforms in the midst of the crisis that we've seen over the last year and a half with veterans not getting the access they need within the Veterans Administration. We are going to continue to monitor that situation, and hopefully under a new secretary, we can see somewhat of a surge internally in this country, making sure that our veterans get the access to health care that they were promised and that they deserve. And lastly, I was proud to lead an effort to reform how the House of Representatives works. We were able to make every expenditure that the House of Representatives puts forth and expends more transparent, more accessible, and I think is making the House the cutting edge on transparency and accountability versus any other branch of government. And I was very honored to lead that bipartisan effort with my colleague Zoe Lofgren under the guidance of House Administration Chairman Candace Miller. Those are just a few of the accomplishments that I'm proud of. I look forward to being able to address many more if the voters send me back to Washington this November.
Thank you. Where do you stand on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and why?
I'm somebody who's always supportive of trade. I frankly led an effort to, when I was a freshman, to ensure that trade was put forth as a priority, because you look at 95% of all of manufacturing right now, the products are going overseas. As a matter of fact, because this administration has said we can't mine as much coal in this country or burn as much coal in this country, when you look at a plant like Caterpillar in Decatur, which employs many UAW workers, they produce mining trucks. And those mining trucks have to be marketed overseas. So we have to have good, fair trade agreements. That doesn't mean that I've been supportive of some of the trade agreements in the past, because we've seen some of the hiccups to those trade agreements. And when I've had a chance to sit around a table like this, I've tried to fix those. As a matter of fact, before I offered my support for Trade Promotion Authority, I was able to work with now Speaker Ryan when he was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and my colleagues Mike Bost and John Shimkus to address an adjudication problem with a process involving steel dumping. Under current law, under the law at that time, the Department of Commerce was hindered in their ability to go out and actually bring suit to against those countries that were dumping steel into our marketplace. And by the time those cases were adjudicated, that steel was already out into the market, and it was already having an ill-advised effect on our domestic steel industry. We changed that adjudication process as part of Trade Promotion Authority, and I was told by steel company, by U.S. Steel just last week, that 3 cases that have been brought under that new process that I helped champion have come back favorable to the domestic steel industry. Those are the types of that's the type of legislating that I went to Washington to accomplish, and I think that's a good example of where we are when it comes to global trade.
What are some of the most pressing transportation waterway needs currently facing the 13th district?
Oh, well, you look at some of them that I'm seeing near completion. Route 29. When I unfortunately witnessed the death of Melody Trauber in December of 1992, if you would have asked us in Taylorville if we'd be satisfied if it took till 2016 to accomplish that project, that 18 miles, make it 4 lanes, we would say no. But that long-term vision is what is needed to be able to continue to invest the precious dollars into projects like that. And I'm glad to see that it's going to be open soon. You look at MacArthur Extension South. That's something I think Sangamon County has got to continue to plan for. And I've been working with County Board Chairman Andy Van Meter and Mayor Langfelter on looking at that as a priority. High-speed rail. We have to finish the corridor and the improvements through Springfield to accomplish the rail relocation and the consolidation, which has been part of Springfield's long-term plan long before high-speed rail was ever a consideration. So these are the types of projects in and around this area that we're going to continue to work on, but it takes policymakers in Washington willing to get beyond the exciting issues that are talked about in the 24-hour news cycle and focus on some of the things like transportation issues for the long term. I think it's a travesty that I sat in an office back in 2005, 2006 on the southwest side of Springfield working on the last long-term transportation bill as a staffer to Congressman John Shimkus. And it took until I went to Congress this term to pass that long-term bill once again. And remember, those monies don't come from the federal, they come from the federal government. They're your gas tax dollars. And we have to have that formula that sends them back to IDOT, and IDOT is the one who actually puts the priorities together so that we can address those long-term goals too.
How many years does the highway bill cover?
This is a 5-year bill.
It's a 5-year bill?
Mm-hmm.
Just as a follow-up to that, could you talk some about the waterways, especially the locks and dams on the...
Yeah, John, I apologize. I
Yeah.
meant to do that. We, in my first term, we actually passed the first long-term water infrastructure bill since 2007. So we were able to reform the way the Corps of Engineers operates. And with that, we don't have the ability anymore to request authorization. Somehow someone labeled that an earmark in Washington, D.C., even though there's no money attached. So we are at the mercy, under the Corps' existing budgetary process, of the executive branch. And what frustrates me the most is that this administration has not prioritized upgrading our locks and dams along the Illinois and Mississippi rivers like they should. They have zeroed out funding for what we call NESP, which is a long-term study of the viability of upgrading all of those locks and dams along our navigation system in the Illinois and waterways. Because the Corps is a project-by-project agency, the president now has to ask for budgetary money in his budget for those individual projects, and he has not done that. We need to fix that in the next WRDA. The WRDA bills used to come every 2 years, and we're trying to get back onto that process. But one of the big things we did in the last WRDA bill, John, was that we changed words on pieces of paper that can really save taxpayers billions. Under the previous law, the average time it took just to get from the idea through design and engineering was 15 years for a project. We reduced it by law to 3. And that's going to get us to construction faster, thus saving taxpayers, in my opinion, billions, and hopefully avoiding any more Olmsteads in the future, which is a lock and dam project in southern Illinois that has gone billions over budget and is a poster child for the failures of how water projects are funded in this country.
And how close is that to completion?
Too close. I want to get it. I mean, we have to get it done. It's imperative that we have that project done to take 2 other existing systems offline and make this upgrade for the 21st century along the Ohio riverways. Hopefully, when that's done, the focus can then be on the Mississippi and the Illinois, where we have bipartisan consensus that things need to be done. 20 years ago, I sat in a conference room at a hotel in Quincy, Illinois, with many of the people now that I now serve with. They serve on my ag advisory board. If you would have asked all of us back then, if 20 years from now we'd see 0 done on this waterway, on upgrading our locks and dams, we would have said that's unacceptable. But what's unacceptable is the status quo, and we've got to continue to change that.
And just for background, just what's the amount of grain, percentage-wise, that flows through the Port of New Orleans for all of the world markets? Is it ballpark 75%?
Absolutely. You stumped me on the exact percentage. I can get that for you, but I would not be surprised if it's upwards of 75% of all the grain. Look, our farmers here, we can't sell enough of the products that we produce on our farms in the domestic market.
Right.
It has to go overseas. We feed the world from Illinois farms, and I think it's underappreciated. And it's also underappreciated what that navigation system means to our farmers being able to get their products in a very cost-effective way out into the global marketplace.
Speaking of water projects in the Corps of Engineers, Hunter Lake.
Yes.
Where do you stand on that, and what would you be working on with that?
40 years.
It's
I think that one's a 50-year.
Oh, I think it's, yeah, I
Just
think
close to
yes,
50
I
now.
think it is.
yeah,
Loose count.
that was a long-term project before I even started working here 20 years ago. Yeah, it's, a lot of it's going to depend upon what the locals want to pursue and what their vision is. And that's part of what I hope I bring to my office, is an ability to work with our local officials on what their priorities are. I'm going to work with the city and Mayor Langfelter and the aldermen to ensure that we do the Hunter Lake project however they envision the Hunter Lake project. I don't believe it's my role to come in and say this is what Hunter Lake should look like, when 50 years ago, when the idea came forth, I'm sure the idea was much different than it is today. So I'll work with them on that.
They seem to have the mayor at least seems pretty clear he wants it to go forward.
Oh, absolutely, he does. And we work with Mayor Langfelder on a variety of projects. Like, I know one project that's a priority for the city is Hilltop Road in the Rochester area and Hunter Lake. So we're going to continue to have very open dialogue and conversation with them and continue the working relationship that we have with the mayor and members of the city council.
Can I do one follow-up on transportation before we move on? You alluded, when we were talking back to the highway bill, gas taxes. Long-term, how do you see the most sustainable funding coming,
Right. Well,
for transportation infrastructure?
we already have the gas tax that every citizen pays every time they pump gas into their vehicle. And at the same time, it's our single source of funding long-term. It's our single user fee. I think that's unsustainable to have just one source at the same time that the federal government is telling car manufacturers to create vehicles that burn less of it. So we are by law diminishing the amount of revenue that can go toward infrastructure, which is not going to cost less in the future, it's going to cost more. So in my opinion, and sometimes I feel like Don Quixote in Washington, I talk about putting a portfolio of sources together. I think everyone around this table would agree with me that in the next 5 years, we're going to see more electric and hybrid technology get into larger vehicles, and the batteries, just like with cell phones, they used to last a couple hours years ago, and now they last a couple days if you don't use them. that's going to be in the vehicle market too, in the vehicle marketplace. We have to prepare for that. And right now, a fully electric vehicle pays nothing towards the Highway Trust Fund. So I think we need to have a debate on things like a national registration fee for electric vehicles and to begin the debate on what's going to be our long-term funding sources. That's when you create a portfolio of sources that's less volatile than relying upon a single source. I would argue that we could then include the provisions that many talk about with energy production, taking revenue based upon increased energy production, putting it towards infrastructure. Tax reform could be a pie in that portfolio. I would argue, and I do, that we should not invest the future of our transportation system in one investment that in the long term is going to go down because of technology and higher gas mileage. Instead, we ought to create a 401k for our infrastructure system. Just like we would diversify our 401ks, we need to diversify the transportation portfolio too.
I want to get to Zika.
Yes.
And the reluctance of Congress to move on that, and kind of what you expect to happen when you return. Can you kind of fill us in on that from your perspective?
Sure. I am constantly amazed how issues that are so important like Zika get caught up in politics. A couple of years ago, I had a roundtable over at Springfield Clinic with doctors, with those in the healthcare community to talk about the crisis at that time, which was Ebola. We were able to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in Ebola research and fighting off that crisis at the time. $600 million was left sitting in an Ebola account unspent when Zika became the crisis that it is today. We passed language out of the House that allowed for that $600 million to be used by the President of the United States to begin the fight against Zika. To me, that's what the taxpayers would want us to do, which is to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars. And if there's $600 million in an account to fight a crisis that isn't a crisis anymore, move it over to one that is. So it took about a month and a half for the administration to do that, and in that month and a half, they stood up and blamed us for not investing enough. Well, that was July, August. The end of the fiscal year is September 30th. We had already pledged another $600 million in the next fiscal year to fight Zika, and that's what we're going to do this week when we go to Washington, is pass a package that's going to be able to address the Zika process. But unfortunately, I learned once again that politics sometimes gets in the way of good policy, even though the president and his administration quietly began spending that $600 million, which could not have been spent in a month and a half. And in the future, I would hope that when we have an unspent amount sitting in an account to address a crisis that's no longer a crisis, that all of us as Americans would come together and say, that's where we start, and then let's debate what the final pay-fors are going to be and the solutions to address the problem in the future. Let's make Zika the crisis that Ebola is today, which is not one.
What
So-
about, go ahead.
So there's no continuing research with Ebola? It's over and done with?
Well, there's,
Spending another cent on that?
no, I'm not saying that, but when you have $600 million sitting there, and Ebola is not the crisis that it is, we can address Ebola research in our annual funding appropriations bills. And not just have $600 million waiting to be spent when it could go to a crisis like Zika, which we've seen grow exponentially in areas where, in areas like Miami, in South Florida, Puerto Rico.
What about, what's your position on any legislation that includes funding for Planned Parenthood on Zika?
Look, I voted for the bill that passed the House that would deny funding for a Planned Parenthood clinic like the one in Puerto Rico. The truth is, you look at one of the clinics in Puerto Rico, they're not even Medicaid eligible, so they're not even eligible for any funding anyway. That's why this becomes an issue of politics rather than good policy. And especially when we're coming up on the election year, that to me, I think the administration has made this more about politics than actually addressing the crisis. Hopefully this week we're going to come together and we're going to move the bill, and this will be the long-term approach this fiscal year to be able to address Zika, and hopefully by next fiscal year it won't be a crisis anymore.
So your objection was because the clinic wasn't Medicaid eligible?
That wasn't an objection, no. I think that's, the objection is, it's not an objection, it's a notation that our initial bill was being held up, even though our initial bill was being held up because of a Planned Parenthood clinic in Puerto Rico that wouldn't be eligible for Medicaid funding anyway because they're not a Medicaid reimbursed facility. So what are we fighting over?
There were 3 incidents this past weekend in Minnesota, New Jersey, and New York with possible terror links. What's the best strategy, in your opinion, for the United States to combat ISIS and other terrorist groups?
Well, we have to do a better job than what I've seen out of this administration. The attacks that you just mentioned, I think, are going to put national security in the forefront of the presidential debate and the presidential election. And I think protecting our homeland is the most important job I have as a policymaker. I have said in this room before, I stand willing to work with the president and this administration to address the growth of ISIS. I think the president missed a tremendous opportunity at the same time he was calling ISIS a JV team, that we could have worked with our allies on the ground in the Middle East to ensure when they were marching unimpeded across the deserts of northern Iraq and Syria, that we could have done something about that JV team before it became a varsity team. The president instead drew a red line in the sand and then walked away from that red line. His solution that he tried to sell to us in Congress was, I'm going to address them in this very messaging-based way rather than a long-term approach. I want the president to work with our allies in the Middle East, Jordan, Egypt, Israel, many others, to put together a long-term plan to continue to push ISIS out of the territories that they control. And we have to have a long-term plan, because once they are pushed out of Syria, which I believe will happen, once they are pushed out of northern Iraq, which I believe will happen, and even out of Libya, they're going to go somewhere. And I was just in Europe on a national security visit with some of my colleagues, and long-term, we need to look at countries like Lebanon and others where ISIS could go and gain a foothold due to the refugee crisis and other things that are happening in the Middle East, where it causes some political instability in certain countries. We have to take the long-term approach to address ISIS and where they may end up. But at the same time, we've got to put a focus on protecting our homeland. And that means ensuring that our law enforcement officials have the tools that they need to address the ever-growing lone wolf threat that we've seen just this past weekend.
Such as?
Well, we did reform the Patriot Act to protect civil liberties. It's something that, I went to Washington and I was concerned with the initial Patriot Act and certain sections of it and how it could have affected civil liberties with the Snowden document release, which was much more than just the NSA surveillance issues. Edward Snowden was a traitor. I've been in classified briefings. Much of the information he released was not relative to the NSA, and the majority of it was relative to our defensive posture globally. And that, to me, makes him a traitor. But we fixed the NSA problems. We made sure that we tamped down on surveillance of American citizens and those who are innocent. But we need tools to ensure that we're able to work with intelligence agencies across the globe to address the ever-growing threat of terrorism that's homegrown in many cases in the countries that are our European allies and other allies throughout the globe, and right here in America.
So where do you draw the line, in terms of surveillance versus trying to find that homegrown?
We did draw the line by shoring up some of the provisions in the Patriot Act with new legislation that we had passed. And remember, too, this has probably been one of the most productive Congresses when it comes to legislating, even though you don't hear about that in the 24-hour news cycle. We have a 22% increase of bills that were enacted into law this year, some of the big issues I talked about before. And a couple of those big issues were related to surveillance and related to law enforcement being able to have the tools that they need to address homegrown and non-homegrown terrorism.
So this, just kind of an out there question, but I'm just always, I get surprised, probably isn't the right word, but really impressed, the breadth and depth of knowledge that you have. So how do you manage to keep up on all of this stuff? Do you
Well,
not watch the 24-hour news cycle?
Well, Jay, I appreciate your comments. I do. A lot of the issues that I now get a chance to work on were issues that I worked on as a staffer for 16 years. The transportation issues, that was part of my portfolio for another member of Congress that I now get to serve with. So many of the issues I worked on the staff side, now I get a chance to sit on the other side of the table and ask the questions that I would have asked when I was frustrated when we couldn't do things to help our communities right here in central Illinois. So a lot of it's because I worked on those issues. But we have to be I have to be willing to learn about any issue that comes to me as part of the legislative process or part of the constituent service process. And that's why I do everything I can to take as many constituent meetings in Washington and back home to hear from the people I represent about issues that are important to them. But we also go into this job with a set of core values and principles and issues that we want to address. I don't consider myself on many of those issues a typical Republican because I want to get into the weeds and address some of the issues that aren't sexy issues. Criminal justice reform. We talked about that the last time I was here, Mr. Wade. This is something that is a failure of this Congress to be able to do when we had an administration that was willing to work with us on this issue. I still think it's a travesty that we have many young people in this country serving more time in prison because they're a drug user than Jared the Subway guy is, who's a child molester pedophile. That's wrong, and our criminal justice system needs to be reprioritized to ensure that we get people the treatment they need, keep them out of the high-cost incarceration, and get them the treatment they need to kick their habit so that they can become productive members of our communities. And it's going to be up to them to want to take that treatment.
You mentioned the Syrian refugees just a while ago. Do you support allowing them to enter the U.S.?
We were able to pass a bill that has now been signed into law that strengthens the vetting process for Syrian and Iraqi refugees. It was obviously bipartisan when the president signed it into law. I think as we've seen ISIS report that they're going to try and circumvent the vetting process through the refugee program, I think it's good for us to take a step back and look at individuals coming through that process with a fine-tooth comb, because we've already seen mistakes. Two Iraqi refugees moved to Bowling Green, Kentucky through that program, and the FBI began monitoring their desire to obtain arms and send them to their brethren in Iraq in Al-Qaeda. We were able to arrest them and see what their plans were. My fear is that not everybody can be monitored like they were. I mean, we hear about the plans that are scuttled, like that one, and like the homegrown terror threat that existed right here in Springfield a few years ago. And we've got to remain ever vigilant, and that to me was a priority that I was glad we passed on a bipartisan basis.
How did it strengthen the vetting? Did it extend, or could you describe that?
Yeah, what it does is it actually allows us to, allows the agencies that are in charge of vetting, it's the American Safe Act, and it's It's tightening the admissions process for refugees with Syrian and Iraqi connections, would require the director of the FBI, the director of national intelligence, and the Department of Homeland Security to certify to Congress that any covered individual is not a threat. Because those three individuals have come in front of Congress, and all of them had said that this process is not up to par.
And assuming that the proper vetting's in place, what levels do you support? How many people, refugees, should be allowed to enter?
Oh, you want me to end up on a commercial like some of these other races, huh? Is that what you're doing, Angie? I think we need to get a process in place before we can start talking about any levels. Look, it's tragic. It is tragic when you see photos of a young toddler and having that toddler's body wash up on shore. I'm a dad. That rips at my heartstrings. It really does. We've got to do what we can to give the refugees what they want most, and that's to go home. Most refugees, and it was when we were on our European national security trip, I heard numbers of polling that came out of the refugee camps, and 93% want to go back to where they came from. So we've got to do more to give them a safe environment to go back to. And we're not doing enough of that. And that, to me, is the first step.
On the presidential race.
Is there one?
You've said Donald Trump needs to grow up. You've said that his comments about the judge were, and I quote, racist and unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
You've said we should discriminate against Americans based on their religious beliefs. And you are still continuing to support Mr. Trump, and you're on his agriculture advisory issue. Can you talk to us a bit about why you support Donald Trump and why you feel he's qualified to be president?
Well, let me first say I don't agree with any politician 100% of the time, but let me also start by saying why I'm not going to support Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has proven already that that she has failed when the phone rang early in the morning. And she is disqualified from being president, in my opinion, over the failures of Benghazi, where the testimony that we've seen showed that our government was more worried about what uniform people were wearing before planes were put into the air to rescue Americans under attack. Remember, in September of 2012, that attack on our consulate was viewed by those attacking as an attack on American soil, because that is viewed as American soil. And this administration failed miserably in protecting all the Americans there, and it was at a cost of the loss of 4 American lives. I'm not convinced, especially when we've seen the testimony, that Hillary Clinton's willing to put political correctness aside to protect American lives overseas. That disqualifies her, in my book, from me voting for her for president. Presidential candidates always will talk about what their vision is, and Congress will have a say in how that vision is implemented. I stand willing to work with any president, and I've shown in my record already working with this president when asked to advise his administration on higher education issues. I stood up and said yes, because it's about doing what's best for this country, not always about what is most highly reported in a campaign. And I joined Mr. Trump's Ag Advisory Board a few months before it was announced. I believe that we have to participate in the process. And I was asked by one of 2 people in this nation that's going to raise their right hand and become president of the United States to advise on issues that are crucial to Central Illinois, crucial to our ag economy. If we don't have our ag economy here in Central Illinois, our economic growth could be stagnant for decades to come. I serve on that board with governors of other states, with former secretaries of agriculture, and I stand willing to advise any candidate on issues that are important to my district. I've been asked to advise, but I have yet to be asked to give any advice, so I'm waiting.
So why do you feel he is qualified to be president?
Well, I don't make that decision. The voters made that decision. As you all know, I supported Marco Rubio in the primary. I still would support Marco Rubio if he was the candidate for president, but he's not. The voters are the ones who pick the two candidates. The voters are the ones who speak to who's qualified and who's not. It doesn't mean, a member of Congress can't stand up and decide whether one is qualified. I get one vote just like everyone else does. I cast mine differently. And they're the ones who are telling us the two that we need to choose from, just like voters tell, people in my district who they get to choose after the primary process. I've been in a primary each election I've run for re-election. And the voters have said, I'm the Republican nominee. So they're the ones that choose me. I don't choose me.
Will you be voting for Mr. Trump?
Yes. At this time.
Sticking with the terrorism, Guantanamo Bay, closing it or not? What's
No.
your position on that and why?
No, there's some of the most dangerous individuals in the globe housed there. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who helped mastermind the terror attacks in 9/11. This is it's a travesty that this administration wants to fulfill a campaign promise made to a certain group of supporters. And what we've seen in fulfilling that promise, what we've seen is an increase in the number of individuals that were housed in Guantanamo Bay going back onto the battlefields to kill Americans and kill our allies. We have to have an adjudication process, and I don't believe that they're eligible for the adjudication process that our Constitution guarantees to American citizens. I think they should be tried in a military tribunal, and the punishment that is exacted if they are found guilty should come from that military tribunal. That's where the president should focus his energies rather than focusing on releasing terrorists back to the battlefield to kill innocent Americans.
So my understanding is, though, that there haven't been all that many that have returned to the battlefield, but more so percentage-wise under President Bush, that's happened to than under President Obama.
Well, I'm not saying this is relative to just this administration. I think President Bush made mistakes too when it comes to Guantanamo and who was housed there and who wasn't.
So even initially opening it, do you think was a mistake?
I'm not going to second guess something that happened when I wasn't in Congress. It was a different time. It was a time where America was, America realized its deficiencies in protecting our homeland against terrorism, and what we saw emerge was a new threat. And I'm not going to second guess the decisions that were made back then. Many of the people that are now the biggest critics of Middle Eastern policy were those that supported that Middle Eastern policy at the time, including a presidential candidate named Hillary Clinton. So as we look forward, we have to do everything we can to make sure that 30% of all of those housed in Guantanamo do not join the battlefield. That's 3 in 10. That's 3 more than should. That's 3 more that could in the future organize attacks to attack America once again or to kill Americans on the battlefield.
So what after all is said and done, though, what's the tipping point with that? Is it when there are 50 people left, then that's too expensive to maintain? When there are 25 people there 20 years from now, is that too expensive?
Again, I'd like to see an adjudication process through our military courts for all of these individuals. And I think that's where both administrations have not done their job.
Right.
But I do not support ever bringing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to American soil.
We've had, of course, a growing number of mass shootings in America,
Yeah.
a couple since you were last here. Every time this comes up, it raises the issue of what can be done to keep firearms out of the hands of people who are mentally ill or people who might have ties to terrorism, in the homegrown. Can you talk about your position on gun measures, gun control measures, and including whether you support blocking people on the no-fly list from purchasing guns?
Well, I support actually enforcing the existing laws. You look at what's happening in Chicago right now. It's a travesty. It's a travesty to see so many neighborhoods become what I would consider, and many would consider, the killing fields. I don't think our policymakers are doing enough to address the root cause of this, and it's not because of our current gun laws, because most of the people that do shootings that are perpetrators of mass shootings or shootings on a regular basis in communities like Chicago throughout this nation, they don't really care if they have a FOID card. I would doubt they bought that gun legally through a store and waited the existing waiting period time to be able to go back and get that firearm. When you pass new laws, it restricts only those who are willing to follow the laws. And one of the issues that I think does not get enough attention that we addressed in the House of Representatives is mental health reform. When you look at mass shootings like Newtown in Aurora, Colorado, there was a clear nexus between the mental health of those individuals and the crime that they committed and the killings that ensued because of that crime. We reformed our mental health system to allow for medical professionals and families to intercede before an individual gets to the crisis stage, the stage 4. The only clinical psychologist in Congress, Tim Murphy, a colleague of mine, wrote that bill. And he's one who actually can speak on a level of authority as to why that is important, because it allows families and medical professionals to avoid the HIPAA considerations that were in effect until we passed this bill. It allows those professionals to get to that individual who could become, at that crisis stage. That's one thing we are doing to address this issue. And those who want to focus on the firearms part of the equation don't want to focus on this. And frankly, that's where I think it needs to be.
So other than HIPAA, what other parts of mental health could be reformed to?
Yeah, that was just one. That was one example. We also want to make sure that we strengthen the ability for mental health professionals to be able to see their patients, and we need to increase access to mental health. Right now, we've got a crisis in our county jails throughout this country where we're housing individuals who are mentally ill because there's no place for them to go get treatment that they need. I've worked with our folks here in Sangamon County and McLean County especially has really led the charge in trying to put together a long-term strategy to address those who are mentally ill and keeping them out of the county jail where it costs taxpayers an exorbitant amount to house them because they have nowhere else to go. So that's that local, state, and federal nexus that exists on an issue as important as addressing mental health. This bill is not going to be the end-all cure, but it's one more step, I think, John, in the right direction that we need to continue to put forth.
Bring back to Central Illinois. So Central Illinois has been affected by opioid abuse.
Absolutely.
What can and should Congress do to help with this problem?
Well, we passed a package of bills to address the heroin and prescription drug epidemic that brought, I think, 18 bills together into one package. And what it did is it some of those bills were pretty simple. It gave liability protections to our first responders who administer Narcan in the midst of a heroin overdose. Who would have thought that we would need to pass a law to give liability, Good Samaritan protections to those who are trying to save a life? But we did, and that was needed. We also increased the amount of training for our law enforcement officials and the opportunity for training to address the epidemics. Who would have thought when we were growing up that heroin would become the problem that it is? When I was growing up, it was only rock stars who were using heroin. And when we saw the epidemic of prescription drug abuse, we tried to address that problem by restricting access. I don't think any policymaker who was in favor of those restrictions ever thought that heroin would become the cheaper alternative to prescription drugs. But that was the result. And we have to fight that scourge at the borders where it's coming in, too. And that's what we are not doing enough of. Heroin exists regardless of socioeconomic strata. It's in rural communities like mine. I can't remember the exact day, but I remember reading a coroner's jury report, and I would have to ask our coroner to verify my facts. But I thought there was in one newspaper a year and a half ago, I believe, 4 deaths attributed in one coroner's jury report to opioids. It's hitting our rural communities, it's hitting our urban communities, and it's so addictive that when one tries to stop it and they come back to it, that's when we're seeing them pass away because they're using levels that they thought their body could handle. We have to have alternatives to pain meds too. I've been supportive of medical marijuana. I think medical marijuana can be utilized to actually reduce our dependence upon opioids. I remember having surgery a decade ago and was given a prescription just in case I had pain, and it was an opioid. I took one, I didn't like it, and I didn't use it anymore. But when they were being given out at that time, I don't think anybody understood the long-term impact, and we've got to address that. And our package of bills was able to do that, and we can get you the details on the rest of them too.
Well, we're talking about big pharma. There was the explosion of that medication price on cancer treatment.
Yeah,
And now we have the EpiPen.
EpiPen.
What is Congress thinking about? Some kind of control of that industry? You know, we have not the best medical system in the world. We have the most expensive medical system in the world. The outcomes are really embarrassing when you look at other countries like Canada, et cetera. So I just think that there's something that needs to be done in some kind of rational control of a company that can take something that costs, you know, $7 or $8 and charge people $600 for it. You know, that just seems like another kind of legalized criminal behavior, in my view.
Well, I think Congress is going to be able to hear from those who were responsible for that decision. We didn't get a chance to hear from that young man who came in front of Congress and was probably the most arrogant, narcissistic individual that I've ever witnessed come before Congress. He had no intention of talking about how the drug company that he once represented was working to save lives. And that, to me, is the mission of all of our medical professionals. It's to help Americans be on the forefront of new and innovative approaches. You know, Kenley, you know my wife's a cancer survivor.
So am I.
Yeah, she is. She's, in her 17th year of being cancer-free from colon cancer. Technologies developed since she was diagnosed are helping to stop cancer from progressing to a stage where it becomes deadly that didn't exist when she was 26 and when she was first diagnosed. Remember, colon cancer isn't supposed to affect 26-year-olds. She was told by a doctor it was in her head. But she was a nurse and said, no, something is wrong with me. Did the blood test, was able to see that she was severely anemic, then misdiagnosed as a blood disorder. She was given transfusions here in Springfield. That didn't work. Eventually, she got the right procedure. They didn't think they'd find cancer, but they did. And she was one of the lucky ones because she caught it at stage 2. Since that time, just the innovation in digital technology has changed the type of tumors that may have been invisible to colonoscopies and scopes in the past that now doctors see. So we have to do more on the diagnostic side too, that I think gets shortchanged when it comes to medical investments into the future. And yes, you're right. We've got to have a more affordable health system that allows Americans the access to the drugs they need to survive, because those innovations are American innovations in many cases, and that's why they're on the market.
Okay. We've actually gone just over our allotted time, so any final thoughts? Any final thoughts from you?
Thank you once again. As I move ahead, hopefully into a next term, if the voters agree that we've accomplished many of the tasks that I laid before them when I asked them for their vote in 2014, I think we have an issue that truly needs to be put to the forefront, and that's addressing pediatric cancer. Right now, the NIH only funds about 4% of their research funding goes toward pediatric cancer. You know, growing up in Taylorville and living there during the cluster of neuroblastoma that affected many families in my community gives me a perspective that's homegrown. And we have to continue to work to reprioritize how Washington spends money to address issues like pediatric cancer, get more research dollars. And that's why we've got to have Republicans and Democrats come together instead of fighting these spending bill wars and getting to the end of the year to put a spending bill together. It stops us from being able to address critical issues like pediatric cancer research throughout the constitutional appropriations process that we should follow. And I'm going to continue to be a voice for more common sense, more bipartisanship, and more activity on the issues that are most important, I think, to the long-term effect or the long-term health of this country.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Thanks. Thank you.